Veteran teacher canceled for sharing his experience. Edward Marshall sat at his desk, savoring the quiet hum of the empty classroom. After 30 years of teaching history, he found solace in these moments before the day began, surrounded by artifacts of his career. Photos of graduating classes, dusty textbooks, and handwritten thank you notes from students. His peace shattered when the principal entered, her face tight with unease, clutching a letter in her hand. "Edward, we need to talk," she said, her voice tinged with hesitation. Moments later, the world as Edward knew it began to crumble. The letter stated that he was being placed on administrative leave, pending an investigation into allegations of creating an unsafe learning environment. The charge? Sharing a personal story from his military service during a lesson on civil rights. The news spread faster than Edward could comprehend. A few students had interpreted his story, a heartfelt recollection of standing against racism in his unit, as offensive and outdated. By lunchtime, social media was ablaze. Memes mocked him. Hashtags like #CancelEdward trended, and outraged parents demanded his resignation. Edward couldn't believe it. For decades, he had poured his heart into teaching, striving to ignite empathy and critical thinking in his students. The story he had shared was one of courage, standing up to a bigoted superior officer to protect a fellow soldier, a lesson about bravery and moral integrity. How had it been twisted into something harmful? His daughter, Laura, called that evening, her voice sharp with disapproval. "Dad, how could you not think this through? Times are different now. People are sensitive, especially kids." Her words stung, cutting deeper than the public backlash. Laura, a passionate social activist, had always been his greatest source of pride. Now, she seemed ashamed of him. Mary, his wife of 35 years, tried to reassure him, but Edward saw the worry etched on her face. "We'll get through this," she said, squeezing his hand. But her eyes betrayed the doubt she wouldn't voice. Edward felt adrift, questioning everything he had ever believed about himself and his career. By nightfall, the protests began. A small group of parents gathered outside their house, holding signs demanding his removal. "Marshall's history is his story," one sign read. Edward watched from behind the curtain, his heart pounding with disbelief. Unable to sleep, Edward sifted through old photographs. One image stood out, his first class, 30 young faces beaming with hope. It reminded him why he had become a teacher in the first place. But now, that legacy felt tarnished, his life's work reduced to a hashtag. As dawn broke, Edward sat in his favorite chair, gripping the suspension letter. He didn't know how or if he could fight this. All he knew was that the man who had dedicated his life to shaping young minds was now a pariah in the very community he had served. Edward's phone buzzed incessantly, but he stopped checking the messages. What began as a flood of support from a few close friends had turned into stony silence. His once tight circle of colleagues avoided his calls, and those he met in public offered polite smiles that didn't reach their eyes. It was clear, no one wanted to be associated with him. The isolation felt like a second punishment, one he hadn't anticipated. Mary, always pragmatic, handed him the number of a lawyer specializing in workplace disputes. "You need to defend yourself, Edward," she urged. "This isn't just about your career, it's about your name." But Edward hesitated. The idea of navigating a labyrinth of bureaucracy and legal arguments felt overwhelming. He was a teacher, not a fighter. The media seized the controversy with unrelenting fervor. Headlines painted him as a relic of a bygone era, emblematic of teaching practices that needed to be reckoned with. One article, filled with quotes from anonymous students, claimed his classroom was a place of intimidation, a far cry from the truth Edward had always believed. Watching the coverage felt like watching his reputation disintegrate in real time. At night, Edward replayed the classroom incident in his mind, searching for the moment everything had gone wrong. He had been discussing the civil rights movement, connecting historical injustices to personal experiences. His story was about a young soldier, himself, standing up to a racist superior officer to defend a black comrade during a heated confrontation. It was a story he'd told for years, a lesson about courage in the face of prejudice. But now, it seemed the very words that once inspired were being used as weapons against him. One evening, a thick envelope arrived in the mail, filled with hate mail. Anonymous writers called him a bigot, a liar, and worse. Edward felt each word like a physical blow. But tucked in the pile was something different, a small, handwritten note. "Mr. Marshall, your lessons changed my life. You taught me to stand up for myself, and I'll never forget it. Please don't give up." The words struck a chord, bringing unexpected tears to Edward's eyes. As he read the letter, the war story he'd shared in class played vividly in his mind. He remembered the stench of sweat and gunpowder, the weight of his helmet pressing down on his brow. His superior officer had ordered him to keep quiet as a fellow soldier was berated with slurs. But Edward couldn't stand by. He had risked his career, and perhaps his life, to defend that soldier, an act that had cemented his belief in the importance of courage and empathy. That belief had guided his teaching for 3 decades. But now, doubt crept in. Was he out of touch? Had his methods been wrong all along? The backlash gnawed at his confidence, making him question whether his values still had a place in the modern world. Mary, steadfast as always, tried to pull him out of his spiral. "Edward, you have to fight back. You spent your whole life helping others. You don't deserve this." But Edward remained paralyzed, guilt and self-doubt weighing him down. He feared that fighting would only deepen the divide, making him an even greater target. Late that night, Edward stood at the window, looking out at the small group of protesters gathered outside. Their signs glowed under the streetlights, their voices faint but persistent. He couldn't make out their words, but the meaning was clear. They wanted him gone. As he watched, a single thought echoed in his mind. How did it come to this? Edward awoke to the sound of chanting outside. A group of parents and activists had gathered in front of his home, holding signs and calling for his resignation. "Protect our kids," and "No place for hate," echoed through the street, their voices rising as cameras from local news stations rolled. Edward peeked through the curtains, his heart sinking. The sight of neighbors he once greeted warmly, now demanding his downfall, felt like a betrayal. The pressure to issue a public apology weighed heavily on him. Mary urged caution, but Edward couldn't shake the thought that a carefully worded statement might calm the storm. Yet the idea of apologizing for something he believed in felt like a betrayal, not just to himself but to the values he had spent his life teaching. He drafted and crumpled letter after letter, unable to find words that balanced integrity with the desperate need for peace. That afternoon, Laura showed up unannounced. Her face was flushed with anger as she stepped into the living room. "Dad, do you even understand what you've done?" she demanded. "You've hurt those kids. You've made them feel unsafe." Her words cut deeper than any protester's chants. Edward tried to explain his intent, but Laura interrupted, her voice cracking. "You've always taught me to think of others, to stand up for what's right. But maybe it's time you realize that being right isn't always enough." Her accusations left Edward reeling. As she stormed out, he retreated to his study, surrounded by the artifacts of his career. His eyes landed on a framed photo of a young Laura, clutching a history trophy from middle school. He remembered how she had once proudly parroted his lessons on integrity during a school debate, how she had always sought his approval. The memory deepened the chasm between them, adding layers of regret to their present conflict. Meanwhile, Mary took matters in her own hands. Determined not to let Edward sink further into despair, she contacted the lawyer she had mentioned earlier, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Angela Carter. "Edward, you need someone in your corner who can help you navigate this," Mary insisted. Angela agreed to take the case, her confidence offering a glimmer of hope. That evening, Edward stumbled across an op-ed written by a former student, now a journalist. The article defended Edward passionately, describing him as a teacher who had inspired countless students to think critically and challenge injustice. The piece resonated deeply, rekindling a flicker of the pride Edward had once felt in his work. Angela advised Edward to tread carefully. "You need to acknowledge their feelings without admitting fault," she said. "It's about optics, not guilt." Together, they began crafting a statement that balanced apology with nuance. For the first time in days, Edward felt like he had some control over the narrative. The school district, sensing the mounting tension, approached Edward with an offer: issue a public apology and undergo cultural sensitivity training, and he could keep his job. The deal was tempting, a way to reclaim his career without enduring a prolonged battle. But the compromise felt hollow. Could he really apologize for a story that had shaped who he was? Later that night, Edward sat down to watch the evening news, hoping for some distraction. Instead, he was confronted with the emotional testimony of a current student. Through tears, the student described how Edward's story had made them feel invalidated and unsafe. The words hit Edward like a blow, unraveling the fragile resolve he had begun to rebuild. Edward sat at the kitchen table, absently stirring a cup of coffee when his phone buzzed. The voice on the other end was hesitant yet familiar. Sarah, a former colleague from his early teaching days. "Edward, I've been following what's happening," she said, her voice low, almost whispering. "I just want you to know I support you. I always admired your teaching, but I can't say anything publicly. You understand, right?" Her words warmed him momentarily, but left him grappling with the loneliness of fighting a battle where even allies feared the spotlight. Meanwhile, Laura experienced an encounter that began to shift her perspective. At a community event, a young woman approached her, recognizing her as Edward's daughter. "Your dad probably doesn't remember me, but he saved my life," the woman said, her eyes welling up. She recounted how Edward's lessons on resilience and integrity had helped her through a turbulent home life. "He made me believe I was worth something." Laura's heart twisted with guilt as she replayed her harsh words to her father. That evening, Edward received a call from the journalist who had penned the op-ed defending him. "Mr. Marshall, I think people deserve to hear your side of the story," the journalist said earnestly. "You've spent your life giving others a voice. Let me give you one now." Edward was torn. The thought of speaking out and potentially facing more criticism was daunting. But the journalist's offer planted a seed of possibility. Mary, ever the strategist, encouraged him. "Edward, people need to hear the truth. If you stay silent, the world will only know their version of you." Her words made sense, but Edward couldn't shake the fear of missteps and further backlash. "What if I make things worse?" he asked, his voice cracking under the weight of uncertainty. Unable to stay idle, Edward visited the school for the first time since his suspension, hoping to find some semblance of comfort in the familiar. Instead, his heart sank as he entered his classroom. The walls, once adorned with posters and maps, were defaced with hateful graffiti. "Liar, bigot, retire already." The sight drove home how far things had spiraled. As he stood frozen in the wreckage, a soft voice startled him. "Mr. Marshall?" He turned to see Sam, the janitor, who had been one of his students decades ago. Sam smiled warmly. "You probably don't remember, but you once stayed after class to help me when I was failing. You didn't just teach history, you taught me how to believe in myself." The words pierced through Edward's despair like a beacon of hope. That evening, Angela, his lawyer, issued a warning. "If you go public, you're opening yourself up to more scrutiny. This could escalate quickly." But Edward, buoyed by the encouragement of unlikely allies, felt a flicker of defiance. "I need to do this," he said. "If I stay quiet, they win. This isn't just about me. It's about everything I've stood for." Sitting at his desk, Edward composed a letter to the school board. Each word was deliberate, heartfelt, and unflinching. He refused to apologize for teaching lessons rooted in integrity and courage, even if those lessons were no longer comfortable for some to hear. With his letter sent, Edward made the decision to accept the journalist's offer for an interview. As he picked up the phone to confirm, he felt a shift within himself. This wasn't just a fight for his reputation. It was a fight for his legacy and the truth he believed in. When the interview aired, Edward could hardly breathe. He watched himself on screen, recounting his story with raw emotion, his voice trembling as he spoke of the war story that had defined his teaching philosophy. The journalist had skillfully framed the narrative, highlighting his dedication to fostering critical thinking and empathy in his students. Still, as the credits rolled, Doubt crept in. Would the world see his sincerity or twist it into something else? The aftermath was immediate. Social media exploded with reactions, ranging from scathing critiques to heartfelt defenses. Hashtags like hashtag Stand With Marshall and hashtag Cancel the Bigot trended side by side. For every harsh comment accusing him of harm, there were voices of support from former students and colleagues. The divide was stark, but Edward took solace in the growing tide of people rallying to his side. Later that night, Laura stormed into the house, her face flushed with anger. "Dad, what were you thinking?" she demanded. "You're making this all about you. What about the students who feel hurt?" Edward's heart ached at her words, but this time, he refused to falter. "Laura," he said softly, "I've always taught my students to think for themselves, to challenge injustice, even when it's uncomfortable. That's what this is about. If I back down now, I'm not just betraying myself. I'm betraying them." His sincerity pierced through her frustration, leaving her silent and visibly conflicted. Mary, ever resourceful, took action. She organized a community meeting, reaching out to parents and former students willing to defend Edward publicly. "This isn't just about Edward," she told them. "It's about protecting the kind of teaching that inspires change." The effort gained traction, and soon, a small but vocal group of supporters began to emerge. But just as momentum seemed to be shifting, a new video surfaced online, a heavily edited clip of Edward's most controversial lesson. Stripped of context, it painted him as callous and dismissive of modern sensitivities. The backlash reignited, and Edward felt the weight of defeat pressing down on him. He shut off his phone, retreating to the solitude of his study. As he sat in silence, the phone rang. Reluctantly, he answered, expecting another angry voice. Instead, he heard the calm, determined tone of a former student. "Mr. Marshall, I saw the interview. You were the only teacher who ever made me believe I could make something of myself. If you need me to speak up, I will." The offer felt like a lifeline, reminding Edward that his work had made a difference. The night of the community meeting arrived, and the school auditorium was packed. The air was heavy with tension as parents, students, and community members took the stage to share their perspectives. Some spoke of the need for change, accusing Edward of being out of touch. Others delivered tearful testimonies of how his lessons had shaped their lives for the better. As the meeting wound down, Edward's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. The message was brief. "There's a recording from the classroom that day, unedited. It proves you didn't do anything wrong. Meet me tomorrow." The words reignited a spark of hope in Edward, one he hadn't felt in weeks. Edward sat across from the journalist in a dimly lit coffee shop, his hands trembling as she slid a USB drive across the table. "This is the unedited recording," she said, her tone serious. "It shows everything, the lesson, the context, the takeaway. It's clear you were teaching empathy and courage." Edward's chest tightened as relief mixed with apprehension. The truth was finally in his hands, but the question remained. What would he do with it? That night, Edward watched the recording alone, his breath catching as he saw himself standing before his students, recounting the war story in full. He spoke of challenging bigotry and protecting a fellow soldier, ending with a call to action for his students to stand against injustice in their own lives. The clip that had gone viral was a gross distortion, cutting out the heart of his message. Mary and Angela reviewed the recording with him the next morning. "We need to release this strategically," Angela advised. "If we just throw it online, it could backfire. Let's consider timing and platforms." Mary nodded in agreement. "This isn't just about proving you're right, Edward. It's about showing people what you've always stood for." With measured determination, Edward sent the recording to the school board, attaching a letter explaining its significance. Days passed with no response. The silence felt deafening, and Edward feared the board was too entrenched in public opinion to take a stand. One evening, Laura found the recording on Edward's computer and watched it in its entirety. Tears streamed down her face as she realized the depth of his intent. "Dad," she said, voice breaking as she approached him in the living room. "I was wrong. I didn't see what you were really trying to do. I'm so sorry." Edward embraced her tightly, the first glimmer of peace he'd felt in weeks. Angela, ever vigilant, issued a caution. The district might retaliate. If they feel cornered, they could try to dig up unrelated issues to discredit you. Be ready. Edward nodded, the weight of the fight pressing down on him. But his resolve had solidified. The truth mattered more than his reputation. As the recording began to circulate online, a shift occurred. Social media, once a battleground of vitriol, saw a surge of support for Edward. Hashtags like #JusticeForMarshall began to trend. Former students posted heartfelt messages about how his teachings had shaped their lives, adding momentum to the tide turning in his favor. The night before his final hearing, Edward sat at his desk, reflecting on the journey that had brought him to this point. The fear, the anger, the doubt, it had all led to this moment. He prepared his statement with care, determined to leave no room for misinterpretation. Edward standing outside the school board's hearing room, the chair opening the door and motioning him inside. "Mr. Marshall, they're ready for you." Edward stepped forward, his heart steady with the conviction of a man who had nothing left to lose but everything to stand for. Edward took a deep breath as he stepped into the hearing room, its sterile walls lined with rows of anxious faces. The school board members sat at the front, their expressions unreadable. He placed the USB drive on the table, his voice steady as he began. "This recording shows what really happened that day. It is my truth, unaltered and complete." The board watched in silence as the video played. Edward's war story filled the room, recounting his defiance of a superior officer's prejudice and his defense of a fellow soldier's dignity. When the recording ended, Edward looked out at the room, his voice tinged with both defiance and vulnerability. "I've spent my career teaching students to think critically, to stand against injustice, and to lead with empathy. If that's wrong, then I don't belong here." The district's lawyer rose, his tone calculated and cold. While Mr. Marshall's passion is evident, his teaching methods are outdated and inconsistent with modern educational policies. He rattled off vague accusations, framing Edward's actions as reckless and potentially harmful. Edward clenched his fists under the table, refusing to let anger cloud his composure. When it was his turn to respond, Edward stood and faced the board directly. "We live in divisive times," he began, his voice rising with conviction. "Teaching courage and empathy isn't just relevant, it's essential. My methods may not fit into neat little boxes, but the impact is undeniable. Look at the students I've taught. They are leaders, thinkers, and change makers. That's the legacy of this work." The board adjourned to deliberate, leaving the room buzzing with tension. Edward sat beside Mary and Laura, who squeezed his hand reassuringly. After what felt like an eternity, the board returned, their faces stern. The chairperson cleared her throat. "Mr. Marshall, we've decided to offer you reinstatement, but with strict limitations on your curriculum and teaching topics." The offer was a lifeline, but Edward knew it came with strings that would compromise everything he stood for. He rose slowly, his voice firm. "I appreciate the opportunity, but I cannot accept terms that undermine the values I've dedicated my life to. My principles are not negotiable." With that, he turned and walked out, the room hushed in stunned silence. As he exited the building, Edward heard a familiar voice. It was Laura, stepping up to the podium where reporters had gathered. "My father taught me to stand up for what's right, even when it's hard," she said, her voice cracking with emotion. "Today, I stand with him." Her words echoed through the crowd, drawing applause and murmurs of agreement. The crowd outside erupted in support. Parents, students, and community members who had come to rally for Edward chanted his name. Signs reading "We Stand with Marshall" filled the air as tears welled in his eyes. Edward walked through the throng of supporters, his heart heavy but resolute. The fight wasn't over, but he knew he wasn't alone. As he reached the street, the crowd parted, and he turned to face them. They gave him a standing ovation, their cheers ringing out as a testament to the courage and resilience he had always sought to teach. Edward woke to the sound of his phone buzzing incessantly. Messages flooded in. Former students, community members, and even strangers from across the country expressing their support. Overnight, a petition demanding his full reinstatement had gained traction, amassing thousands of signatures. The story had gone national, sparking debates about free speech and the role of educators in shaping young minds. Mary beamed as she handed Edward his morning coffee. "You started something bigger than just this school, Edward. People are listening." Though humbled by the support, Edward still felt the weight of the journey. "I just want to make things better," he murmured, gazing at the stack of letters from supporters piling up on his kitchen table. Inspired by the outpouring of support, Edward began drafting a memoir. Each chapter recounted a pivotal moment in his teaching career, weaving in the lessons he'd shared and the challenges he'd faced. The process was cathartic, allowing him to transform pain into purpose while addressing the broader struggles plaguing education. Meanwhile, the journalist who had defended Edward published a follow-up article. It detailed his unwavering commitment to his students and framed him as a symbol of integrity in a divisive era. The article went viral, adding fuel to the growing movement demanding accountability from the school board. Laura, invigorated by her father's courage, found her own voice in the aftermath. She began speaking at community events, advocating for free speech in education and emphasizing the importance of teaching critical thinking and empathy. "My dad didn't just teach students," she said during a rally. "He taught them how to be human." Her impassioned speeches drew attention, making her a rising figure in the debate. Under mounting public pressure, the school board called an emergency meeting and reversed its decision, offering Edward his job back with no restrictions. But when Edward received the news, he simply shook his head. "I can't go back," he told Mary. "My time in that classroom is done. It's time to help others carry the torch." Instead of returning, Edward chose to retire from formal teaching, redirecting his energy to mentoring young educators. A nonprofit organization, inspired by his story, invited him to lead a program dedicated to promoting empathy in education. Edward eagerly accepted, envisioning a platform to help others navigate the challenges he had faced. Months later, Edward stood in front of a room filled with aspiring teachers. The seminar buzzed with energy as he shared stories from his career, emphasizing the importance of courage, compassion, and resilience. Laura sat in the front row, smiling proudly as she watched her father inspire a new generation. As the seminar ended, a young teacher approached Edward, her eyes brimming with tears. "Thank you," she said. "You've shown me what kind of teacher I want to be." Edward smiled, his heart full. He had fought for his values, weathered the storm, and emerged with a legacy that would endure through those he had inspired. Years had passed, but Edward's impact continued to ripple outward, touching lives in ways he never imagined. Former students and young teachers who had been inspired by his journey shared their stories. One student, now a civil rights attorney, credited Edward with sparking their passion for justice. Another had become a teacher, incorporating Edward's lessons of empathy and courage into their own classroom. At a dedication ceremony on a crisp autumn morning, Edward and Mary stood in awe before a plaque that read, "The Edward Marshall Scholarship Fund, Inspiring Future Educators." The fund had been established to support aspiring teachers committed to fostering empathy and understanding. As Edward shook hands with the first recipients, he felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude and purpose. Laura, now a celebrated author, unveiled her latest book, Bridging the Divide, A Father and Daughter's Journey to Understanding. Her book chronicled their struggles, reconciliation, and the broader societal issues they had faced. "This isn't just my father's story," she said at the launch event. "It's a story about finding common ground in a fractured world." The book resonated deeply, becoming a beacon for those navigating similar conflicts. Meanwhile, Edward's memoir, Lessons in the Fire, A Teacher's Stand for Truth, climbed bestseller lists, sparking a national conversation on education reform. Critics praised its raw honesty and call to action, while readers found hope and inspiration in its pages. Edward received invitations to speak at conferences and panels, sharing his vision for a more compassionate and inclusive educational system. Despite the accolades and recognition, Edward's happiest moments were the quiet ones spent in his garden. On a warm spring afternoon, he sat beneath a blooming cherry tree, a cup of tea in hand, reflecting on the twists and turns of his journey. Mary joined him, her hand resting on his. "Do you ever wish you'd done anything differently?" she asked softly. He smiled, his gaze distant yet content. "I've made mistakes, but I wouldn't trade the lessons learned or the lives touched for anything. Integrity isn't easy, but it's worth it." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over their garden, Edward felt a profound sense of peace. He had faced adversity, stayed true to his values, and left behind a legacy of courage and compassion that would endure long after him.